Welcome to the debate. Our focus today, it's really on the architecture of online trust and what happens when that architecture meets, well, explosive ideological conflict.
Exactly. We're looking at a specific X space hosted by Alberto Daniel Hill. Now, he built his platform on this promise of radical transparency, creating a quote-unquote safe space for personal narratives, particularly around systemic failure, cybersecurity, and institutional trauma. And this focus, it's important to note, is rooted in his own experiences.
Right, his own wrongful imprisonment experience really informs that. And the material we're dissecting today centers on the, let's say, highly charged testimony of a PhD student, Daniela. She came forward detailing alleged systemic corruption, pretty severe nepotism, privacy invasions, and retaliation at York University, all following her reports of what she saw as deeply unethical practices.
And the real conflict here, the question for us, isn't necessarily about whether every single one of Daniela's claims is verifiable fact. It's more about the platform itself.
Yeah, the central question is this. When a host commits to providing a safe space for these kinds of narratives, these stories of systemic injustice, does that structure just inevitably buckle, maybe even collapse, when guests inject highly charged ideological rhetoric? Or is the failure simply down to a breakdown of conduct, by the co-participants themselves?
That's the core of it.
So my position is that Hill's hosting structure, the framework he set up, was fundamentally sound. It was robust enough, I believe, to handle the trauma narrative. The conflict we saw arose because individual speakers failed to adhere to the space's established ethos.
And I come at it from a different way. I think the foundation itself proved inherently unstable in this instance. It simply wasn't designed, perhaps couldn't be designed, to contain the specific kind of intense, ideologically charged conflict Daniela brought in when she connected her personal institutional trauma to much broader geopolitical and political grievances.
Okay, let's lay out the positions then. From my side, Hill's strategy, it really emphasizes addressing systemic failure through peer-to-peer connection. It's advocacy, yes, but rooted in technical facts and lived experience. And that's precisely why he solicited Daniela's story in the first place and why he listened, quite intently actually, to her claims of gang bullying and torturing and this alleged institutional complicity. He was trying to provide a compassionate, structured platform for someone claiming to be a victim of serious institutional abuse.
I see why you frame it that way, but I think Hill's framework, built as it was on a kind of generalized trust and peer support, it almost immediately showed its limits. It failed to account for the sheer toxicity and the ideological intensity introduced by Daniela's specifics. Her claims, they started with potentially verifiable institutional complaints, things like unethical hiring practices. You mentioned the unqualified husband allegedly teaching statistics. Okay, that's one level.
Right.
But then it quickly escalated, didn't it? To sweeping, often unsubstantiated claims like Zionist domination of Canadian media, police complicity, linking everything back to what she broadly termed genocide. The space might have been built for systemic complaints, but what it got felt much more like political warfare.
But look, Hill did try to triage this narrative. And triage in this context, it means sorting, trying to separate the verifiable claims from the more, let's say, emotionally charged rhetoric. When Daniela brought up the technical side of her harassment, things like spyware hacking, Hill actively tried to pivot the conversation there. He attempted to anchor those claims in something more objective, something potentially verifiable. He even referenced organizations like Citizen Lab.
Okay.
Whose work investigating state-level spyware, Pegasus, and so on is globally recognized. He was making an effort, you see, to move the discourse away from just generalized anger towards a more fact-based discussion. That, to me, shows the structural design intended to prioritize technical investigation over, well, just unfiltered venting.
That's an interesting point about the intent, though I'd argue the structural failure became blindingly apparent the moment Daniela shifted focus, specifically when she started discussing the deeply personal psychological aspects of her trauma. The detail about texts from her private diaries being weaponized for online harassment. The response wasn't triage, it wasn't support. It came from a co-speaker, Helen, and it was immediate, overt, and frankly, hostile psychological invalidation. Helen's directive, and it's a direct quote, was, "Daniela, I would recommend you go see a doctor." That single comment, right there, proves Hill's foundation didn't provide adequate psychological safety in practice. It's incredibly difficult to call a space safe when a guest detailing psychological torture is immediately met with the exact kind of gaslighting they're describing being subjected to.
Okay, that definitely brings us squarely to this issue of psychological invalidation versus the host's responsibility. Helen's comment was highly confrontational. Yes, it was dismissive. And Daniela herself immediately identified it, didn't she, as that crazy-making tactic she felt her alleged harassers used. I absolutely grant you that this hostility directly undermined the whole safe space ethos Hill was attempting to cultivate.
Yes, exactly. And the fact that the platform, the space itself, almost instantly produced the very hostility Daniela was describing, well, that demonstrates the framework was overwhelmed. When the narrative shifts from maybe generalized trauma or even specific but verifiable institutional complaints to a more controversial, let's say mixed psychological profile where you have valid activism points interwoven with highly politicized, possibly unsubstantiated claims, the framework just kind of shatters because it seems to lack any mechanism to moderate the immediate personal biases or reactions of the co-speakers in that moment.
However, it's crucial to remember Hill himself wasn't the source of that hostility. And importantly, the community, or at least part of it, did attempt to self-correct. We saw the third speaker, Pharaoh, step in. Pharaoh acknowledged how severe Helen's comment was, calling it really harsh, even the most rudest thing, and offered an apology directly to Daniela. This external correction, this community-led response, one speaker defending the guest against another, it shows that the intended social contract, the expectation of intellectual charity, was recognized and someone tried to defend it. The structure arguably resisted the breach. The structure didn't inherently cause it.
Resisted? Or perhaps just shifted the problem? Because that resistance, as you call it, pretty quickly turned into what felt like suppression. Which brings us to the next point, the conflict over imposing ideological boundaries. Following Helen's remark, Pharaoh intervened again, didn't she? Setting what she explicitly called hard boundaries against Daniela's rhetoric. She stated very clearly she did not want to hear hatred, Zionism, Jews, and whatever. Now, was this an attempt to steer the conversation back toward collaborative, non-sectarian discourse, away from those broad negative labels like they and them? Maybe, but we have to ask, was this structural maintenance, or was it effectively structural censorship?
Well, I'd argue Pharaoh was prioritizing the positive space foundation that Hill was trying to build over Daniela's very aggressive ideological framing. This felt like necessary boundary maintenance. Hill's entire model seems to rely on a degree of intellectual charity. This idea that you assume good intent, focus on the systemic issue being raised, and try not to get bogged down in broad, divisive labels. When a guest, perhaps understandably, given their trauma, but still, when they violate that charity so forcefully, the community or elements within it have to police those boundaries to protect the integrity of the collective space. Otherwise, the whole thing collapses into shouting.
I'm just not convinced that was truly possible or even desirable here. Pharaoh's action, while maybe maintaining a semblance of order, effectively stifled Daniela's perceived truth. It cut off her narrative at a critical juncture for her. Daniela explicitly felt that the connection between her specific university experience, the nepotism, the unqualified faculty member, and these broader ideological forces she was naming was essential context, even if it was phrased aggressively, maybe even problematically to some listeners. The framework, in that moment, forced an impossible choice. Either Daniela expresses her trauma authentically, as she understands its roots, or she adheres to a prescribed, non-confrontational language. That limitation, that forcing of a choice, feels like a structural flaw to me. It essentially demands self-censorship for the framework to even survive the conversation.
Let's maybe pivot slightly to the challenge of triage itself, separating verifiable claims from these highly ideological, often unsubstantiated narratives. Because Daniela's testimony did include genuinely verifiable, or at least highly plausible, institutional issues. We talked about the unethical hiring, the nepotism claims. There were documented issues, or at least widespread discussion, about universities like York acting as a profit-based business model, especially concerning international students. And her comparative claim that Canadian academia is, say,
100 years behind Europe, while maybe hyperbolic, points to real debates about academic standards. Hill's foundation did successfully bring these systemic failures into the light. That right there, that's a structural success, platforming important, specific, systemic critiques.
And this is the crucial bud. The platform struggled profoundly, almost immediately, to vet and contain the other elements she introduced at the same time. Daniela brought in these high-stakes, unvetted elements that some sources later described as exaggerated conspiracies that lack evidence. Things like specific named collaborations with, quote, Jordan Peterson's cult, or claims of deep police complicity in some grand scheme against her, tying it all back to this idea of Canadian media being Zionist-dominated. And we know actually from Hill's own internal communications around that time that he was struggling in real time to triage this. He was trying to find links, asking for evidence for her hacking claims from a technical standpoint.
Right, you wanted the LinkedIn posts.
Exactly. While also expressing frustration, reportedly with co-speakers who were talking over him or maybe weren't engaging with the technical facts he was trying to focus on. The structure just wasn't equipped to handle this volatile mix of potentially valid activism and what appeared to be unsubstantiated claims. This blend led directly to that intense skepticism from co-speakers and, ultimately, the breakdown of anything resembling productive dialogue. A safe space model, built mainly on emotional support and this generalized trust, it simply lacks the necessary maybe academic rigor or the sophisticated real-time moderation tools to effectively vet highly sensitive, mixed claims on the fly, especially when they intersect with volatile global politics.
So from my perspective, the conflict ultimately was fueled by individual choices within that space. Helen's dismissal, Foro's perhaps understandable but rigid imposition of those hard boundaries. Hill provided the platform, the microphone, and the ethos of intellectual charity, the fact that the speakers themselves, in the heat of the moment, violated that charity. Well, that doesn't invalidate the model itself. It just highlights the immense difficulty of enforcing good conduct in live, unfiltered public forums, where the human element is inherently unpredictable, maybe even uncontrollable.
And I would argue, respectfully, that the experience suggests the opposite. That the safe space foundation is inherently fragile, maybe even insufficient, when it confronts a guest whose deeply personal trauma is perceived by them to be inextricably linked to broad, highly charged political accusations. The immediate ideological conflict wasn't an aberration. It felt like an inevitable structural outcome because the framework wasn't built, perhaps couldn't be built, to contain such volatile material without either suppressing the guest's authentic narrative or sacrificing intellectual rigor. In a way, the platform failed at its primary stated job, supporting the individual narrative without collapsing the discussion.
Well, this entire episode, I think we can agree, serves as a really powerful illustration of that inherent tension in these kinds of public forums. You're constantly trying to balance intellectual charity, providing a necessary platform for often raw personal trauma, while simultaneously needing to maintain necessary boundaries against rhetoric that might be highly volatile, potentially divisive, or simply unsubstantiated. It's a difficult line to walk.
Indeed. And the case of Daniela really highlights the immense complexity of managing intellectual exchange when the personal, the institutional, and the geopolitical all intersect so dramatically. It forces us to keep asking whether platforms like these can truly manage unfiltered, authentic narratives without imposing ideological constraints that, risk censoring the guest's lived experience on one hand or completely destroying the integrity and usefulness of the discussion itself on the other. There's clearly much more to unpack and explore in this material.